ठीक है। Well, good morning. Now, in yesterday's class, we had talked a lot about the social contract theory, first important theory of ethics. So, we had seen there the importance of that idea of social contract and limitation of that. So, we had seen that in social contract theory, that this theory tells us in order to keep harmony and peace in society, it's very important that we all have a social contract where a certain expected behavior should be determined by law, which should be enforced by a government, by the state. So that we had seen yesterday, but the problem in this theory, as we had seen perhaps towards the end of the class yesterday, was that this theory does not tell us which law is good and which law is bad. This is exactly what we will be talking about now in today's class onwards. So today we will talk about the second important theory of ethics in our course, that will be utilitarianism, which, as I told you in our introduction class the day before yesterday perhaps, that it was developed by, or rather yesterday itself, a very influential British philosopher called Jeremy Bentham. So we will talk about, in today's class essentially we will talk about the idea of Jeremy Bentham most of the class today, and end of the class today in the evening we will talking about the second important philosopher in utilitarianism, that will be John Stuart Mill. So let us start with the Jeremy Bentham's idea in utilitarianism. So write down firstly, there are two aspects of Bentham's theory. There are two aspects of Bentham's theory. First one, consequentialist aspect. There are two aspects of Bentham's theory. First is called consequentialist aspect. Now write down a few lines firstly. According to Bentham, no action is right or wrong. No action is right or wrong in itself. No action is right or wrong in itself in an absolute and categorical terms. No action is right or wrong in itself in an absolute and categorical terms. It becomes so on the basis of the consequence that it produces. It becomes so on the basis of the consequence that it produces. It is the consequence, one more line you can write, it is the consequence which gives the, it is the consequence that gives the true moral value. It is the consequence that gives the true moral value to any action. It is the consequence that gives the true moral value to any action. Now, this can be the starting point of our discussion of utilitarianism. The idea is that we had talked about that perhaps in yesterday's class already, that according to people like Jeremy Bentham, no action is right or wrong in itself. Suppose, for example, there are two choices in front of you, say A and B, and you have to make a decision what is right and wrong. Then just looking at the action itself, you can never decide what is right and wrong. Nothing is right, nothing is wrong. Now, so actions are, according to people like Bentham, actions are value neutral. Actions are value neutral. There is no value into actions. Actions are neutral in terms of their value. Value means what? Degree of rightness and wrongness. So actions are neutral in terms of their degree of rightness and wrongness. They are neither right nor they are wrong. Now, if the actions are value neutral, then how do you decide the morality of an act? Well, Bentham will say, as we saw yesterday, that there will be consequence. Suppose C1 is a consequence of that act and C2 is the consequence of that act. So, that it is the consequence that gives a moral value to the action. So, values are neutral otherwise, but they receive their moral value from the consequence. C1 will is a consequence, will give a moral value to A, and this consequence will give a moral value to B. So, for example, if C1 is a better good consequence, then it will give a higher moral value to A will become right. And if C2 is a bad consequence, then it will give a lower moral value to B and B will become a wrong action. So, actions are right, become right and wrong through the consequence that they create. Consequence is the source of value, consequence is the domain of value, consequence is the criteria to determine the values. Actions do not have the value, value exists in the domain of consequence. That is the basic idea that consequentialism of Bentham talks about. Write down further. Thus, that action is the right action. Thus, that action is the right action which produces the best consequence or maximum utility. That action is the right action which produces the best consequence or maximum utility. Now, that is the idea. Idea is that action is the right action which produces best consequence, C1 maybe, and which he called maximum utility. So, this utility term is important here. Now, today we use the term utility in very different manner. We often talk about utility bill, utility shop, etc. But at the time of Bentham, in the 17th century, 18th century, so at the time of Bentham, you can see this term utility was just a synonym of consequence. It was just a synonym of consequence, and it was his personal preference, Bentham's, that he used the term utility in place of consequence. So, it was just a personal preference and eccentricity, you can say, that he preferred the term utility rather than consequence. So this is what he will say. So, that action will be the right action which produces the maximum utility. So, in his language, well, C1 is the utility of A and C2 is the utility of B. C2 is the utility of B. So, when you instead of the term, and it is from this term utility that the theory has got its name, utilitarianism. So, this is what perhaps Bentham will say. क्या? अच्छा. So, the C1 is the utility of A and C2 is the utility of B. So, Bentham will say that every action has a utility, has a consequence, and that determines the morality. So, for example, what is the utility of this classroom for you people? Well, utility of this classroom is that it can help you to create better prepared for the UPSC mains exam. So, every action, so this classroom may have a consequence for you that it can help you to prepare better for the exam. That is its utility, that is the consequence. So, this is what why he used the term utility, that is why he called this theory as utilitarianism, utility, the theory of utility maybe. Now, the next important question that comes up now is that if in order to decide about morality, if you have to compare the of course, we have to compare the consequence C1 and C2. Now, what makes it possible for us to compare the consequence? This is where another very important and perhaps a very original contribution of Jeremy Bentham will come in the moral philosophy. So write down further. In order to compare the different consequences of an act, we should convert them into a single scale of value. We should convert them into a single scale of value. He believed that, write down further, he believed that values differ from each other. He believed that the values differ from each other only in quantitative terms. Values differ from each other only in quantitative terms. There are no qualitative difference. There are no qualitative difference between the values. There are no qualitative difference between the values. So this is an important thing that we have to further understand. The idea is that before we talk about single scale of value, let us talk about the differences. Now, if you look at the differences between the different things, then you will realize that all the differences between the things can be of two types. One type of difference is called quantitative difference. What is the meaning of the term quantitative difference? When two things are different from each other in terms of a number. And two things are different from each other in terms of some amount, or when they are different in terms of certain quantity. So when things are different from each other in terms of some number, some amount, or some quantity, then we call them as quantitatively different things. So, and things which are quantitatively different in terms of number or amount, they can be compared. Because numbers are something that can be compared. You can talk about large number or small number. So numbers can be compared. So quantitatively different things can be compared with each other. So suppose, for example, well, we can compare, for example, you can compare the length of this marker, this pen that I have, from the distance of my home from this place, or maybe even the distance of sun from the earth. This is very small, a few centimeters, and that may be millions of kilometers, but even then they can be compared, because difference between the two is just that of number. It is small in number, that is large in number, but nevertheless they can be compared. It is just about a single, both of them occur on a single scale of length. So we can convert them into a single scale. We can easily compare them, which is small, which is large. They are called quantitatively different. On the other hand, some differences are qualitatively different. What is meaning of qualitative difference? Qualitative difference means that when things are different in terms of their nature, they are different in terms of their nature, they are different in terms of their character, maybe they are different in terms of their quality. So they are different in terms of their quality. So when things differ from each other in terms of their nature or character or quality, then they cannot be compared. Comparison is impossible in that case. So suppose, for example, you cannot compare the length of this marker from the time that you see in your watch. They are two different. It is not something that large or small. It is just a two very different thing. Time cannot be compared with the length. So they are on a two different scale which are incomparable from each other. So we cannot compare length with time. Though in India sometimes we do that. If you ask somebody that how far this place is, the person may possibly tell you 2 minutes or 10 minutes distance. Now 10 minutes and distance, physics does not allow that. But in India sometimes we do that, we often understand that we are so intelligent, but physics does not allow 2 minutes distance. Distance must be in kilometers or centimeters or light years. Time must be in second, minute, hours, etc. So second, minute, hours, month, years, whatever you can see. So that is how the time can be measured. So things which are qualitatively different cannot be compared, they cannot be put on a single scale, they occur on two different scale, qualitatively different. Now coming back to the value, Bentham will say that all the values differ from each other only in terms of their quantity, number. There is no qualitative difference between the value. Because of that, every value can be compared with any other value. You can, for example, compare the value of this marker with the value of my life or our liberty maybe. So all the values can be compared with each other. So this idea is single scale of value. All the values occur on a single scale so that we can make a comparison between them. Now this idea was very original and very important idea in modern ethics. We will see a lot about that in practical application later on in today's class, this class itself. So today itself we will talk about how this idea can be actually seen in the world today, single scale of value. As of now, just remember that he believed that values differ from each other only in terms of quantity. So all the values can be put on a single scale and so they can always be compared. So that is one of the important aspect of the consequentialism of Bentham. All the consequences must be compared by converting them into a single scale of value. We will come back to this idea later on when we talk about application of his theory, but let us talk about the second aspect of his theory now. That was the consequentialist aspect, first aspect of his theory. The second aspect is, write down, hedonistic aspect. Second aspect of his theory is called hedonistic aspect. Now write down firstly in this one. According to Bentham, every person always wants to have maximum pleasure and minimum pain. Every person always wants to have maximum pleasure and minimum pain. They are pleasure and pain. They are our sovereign masters. They are our sovereign masters. They are our sovereign masters. Now this is the next important thing that he makes an assumption. He says that one of the most basic aspect of human nature is that every person in the world, regardless of who that person is, every person always wants to have maximum pleasure and minimum pain. He used the term sovereign master. He claimed that these two are pleasure and pain. They are our sovereign masters. In the sense that he had said, there is a quotation of Bentham, he had said that nature has placed us, the human being, under the rule of two masters. There are two masters above us and we all are working, like living our life like a slave under them. Now what these two masters do for us? Now he said that these two masters, pleasure is one master which tells us about our do's, and pain is the second master which tells us about our don'ts. So pleasure tells us do this, it will give you pleasure. Pain tells us don't do that, that will give you pain. So our do's and our don'ts are always determined by pleasure or pain. They are our masters and we are slave under them all the time. Nature is master, pleasure and pain, and we are the servant, we are the slaves, simply following the orders, command of the master. And these are the two commands, do's and the don'ts. Write down further. Since they determine, they means pleasure and pain, since they determine everything that we do, since they determine everything that we do, so they alone can determine, since they determine everything that we do, so they alone can determine what we ought to do as well. Out means O-U-G-S-T. So they alone can determine what we ought to do as well. Thus that action is the right action. Thus that action is the right action which produces the maximum happiness, which he defined as the overall balance of pleasure over pain. Which he defined as the overall balance of pleasure over pain. So that action is the right action which produces maximum happiness, which he defined as the overall balance of pleasure and pain. So now that is the moral aspect, normative aspect of his theory. He says that since pleasure and pain determine everything that we do or do not do, so they alone can determine what we ought to do or what we ought not to do as well. So that action is the right action which he says creates maximum happiness. Now happiness, if you look at it, happiness is a very controversial concept in the field of philosophy. So different people have defined happiness very differently. So, but Bentham gave a very exact or sort of mathematical definition of happiness. He says that each action creates some pleasure also and each action creates some pain also. We will see some example of that shortly. So each action creates pleasure as well as pain. Calculate total pleasure, calculate total pain also, subtract the two. Now whatever is the balance of that is what he called the happiness. So if the pleasure is more than the pain, then the balance will become positive and the action will become right. So he says here that if the pleasure is more than the pain, then the balance will become positive and happiness will become high. That will make your action right. But if the pain is more than the pleasure, then the balance will become negative, happiness will become negative, that will make your action wrong. So he says that is the only standard of morality. Measure the happiness, measure the pleasure, and measure the pain, and check a balance of that. And depending on the balance, depending on the remaining of that, depending on the result of that subtraction, well, you can decide whether the happiness is there or not. So that is one thing that he talks about. There was a question, let me see it here only. Okay, 2-3 questions are there. One, sir, in social contract theory, if only a state has the power to use force, then what gives us the idea that a state will never do anything wrong? That was the problem. I already told you that a state can become extremely wrong also. I might have talked about that in yesterday's class and at the end. So that is the criticism of Hobbesian idea, that Hobbes did not say that a state can be wrong also. He was of this opinion, king can never do wrong. King can do no wrong. You must have heard that famous dictum of people like Thomas Hobbes. So force can, even if it is wrong, then you have to accept that as justified. So it is right and wrong is not the question, justification is the question. So if the force is used by the state under law, that is an important thing, remember. So if the force is used by the state under law, then that is justified. So police cannot simply kill you anybody. It must use force only by under law. So that force is justified, otherwise force will be justified. But law can be unethical also, as we have talked about earlier. Holocaust was legal, remember. So that is why we have to study other theories also, that how can we justify the law. So for that you will have to wait for other classes. Next question, Shubhankar. Values can only be measured in quantitative terms. Sir, could you explain this statement incorporating people and their behavior? Yes, Shubhankar, the whole class is about that only. So this class and the next class will be, today's class will be essentially about that only. So wait for that, try to understand each concept here. So at the end of it, I will tell you what is that, how can we explain human behavior on the basis of that quantified value. So hold on for that, understand what we are talking about right now. So he will say that that action is the right action which produces the maximum happiness. Now, till this point, if you look at it, his theory appears to be very sort of commonsensical theory. Who does not want happiness? Who can deny that happiness is important? But after that, this theory becomes a little more expansive in a way. It will become more expansive in a way, because next question comes up is that if happiness is the basis, is to be the basis of ethics, then whose happiness it is? My happiness, your happiness, or somebody else's happiness? Because that may be a little complicated. Suppose, for example, suppose we are in Delhi, we have an offline class, and suppose your class is early in the morning, 7 o'clock, and suppose 7:30 maybe. Now suppose in order to reach your class on time, I have to leave my home say at 6:30, for which I have to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning, which I do not want. I want to have an extra sleep for half an hour and be late in the classroom. Now if that will give me happiness, of course. Now for the sake of my happiness, if I am late in the classroom, then it will make me happier, no doubt, but it will create lots of unhappiness to my students who are waiting for me since so early in the morning. So after that the question comes up, whose happiness is more important, my happiness or your happiness, student's happiness? Now that is where the important question comes up, and Bentham gives an answer to that question also, which makes his theory much bigger, larger and objective theory in a way. So change the paragraph and then I have to write further. But in order to make happiness as the basis of ethics, we cannot consider the happiness of any particular individual. We cannot consider the happiness of any particular individual, full stop. Ethics must be based on the happiness of all those people. Ethics must be based on the happiness of all those people who are affected by an act. Ethics must be based on the happiness of all those people who are affected by an act. All those people who are affected by an act. Now, this is the next important thing. The idea here, he says here that happiness is important as the basis of ethics. But if you have to make happiness as the basis of ethics, then it cannot be the happiness of any particular individual like my happiness or your happiness. So, particular individual like me and you, our happiness is not important. Ethics must be based on the happiness of all those people who are affected by an act, because we all know that our action has a consequence not only for us. Our action has a consequence for other people as well. So, my act of being late in the classroom does not have consequence only for me, that it makes me happier. It has consequence for other people also, like my students, for example. So, our action influence other people also, it has consequence for them also. I cannot consider consequence only for me. I must take into consideration consequence of my action on everyone. So, we must take into consideration, and that consequence is the happiness, remember. So I must take into consideration the happiness of everybody who is potentially affected by my act. In a way, what he is saying here, that he said that every group of people, as small as this classroom, for example, or as large as the whole population of Delhi, for example, or the population of India, or the whole of humanity. So every group of people, as small as this classroom or as big as the humanity, every group of people have a collective common pool of happiness. Let's call that happiness something like this. There is a question, uh, 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 does the theory of utilitarianism alone can be the final test of adequacy of law? Had it been so, then today would have been our last class. So if you get a final answer, then that will be the last class. We have many more classes after that. So why are you worried about the final answer on day one? And so it is just the beginning of our discussion of ethics. Don't wait for the final answer on so soon, because final answer is the end of the class. Isn't it? So on the day we will get final answer, we will not have any other class of ethics. So as long as we have other classes of ethics, there is no final answer. So keep that in mind. So coming back to this point again, what we were talking about, that every group of people, as small as this classroom or as large as the whole of humanity, has a collective pool of happiness. It's called that as total happiness, collective happiness, aggregate happiness. So if you take this classroom again, that this virtual classroom that we have, then this classroom also has a collective pool of happiness, aggregate happiness, in which we all contribute. So in this case, suppose for example, these are the people in this classroom. Suppose this is me, that is you, that is a third student, fourth student, fifth, sixth and sixth, so on. Now, I also contribute to that total pool of happiness that exists in this classroom, again in an abstract manner maybe. You also contribute to that total pool of happiness, this person also, that person also. So we all contribute to that total pool of happiness that exists in this classroom. Now Bentham is saying, here that, well, this happiness that should be the basis of ethics, it cannot be the happiness of any particular individual like my happiness or your happiness. It must be the happiness of everybody who is affected by our act. So if my action, this is the collective happiness. So he will say here aggregate happiness. He will say here that if my action increases the total happiness in the society, then that will be the right action. And if my action reduces the total pool of happiness in the society, then that will be the wrong action. So he says here that, so that is the only way to decide, not my happiness or your happiness. So for example, if I am late in the classroom by half an hour and I become happy, but it will create a lot of unhappiness for others. I may become happy personally maybe, but my students will become unhappy because of that. So total happiness in the society will be reduced because of my act of being late. So I must take the pain of, Bentham will say, I must take the pain of getting up early in the morning and be on the time, even if that will create a little inconvenience for me, because a little inconvenience for me will make other people happier. So, and that will ultimately increase the total happiness in the society. So in this case, it is my moral duty to bear that inconvenience, get up early in the morning and be on time in the classroom. So ethics cannot be based on happiness of one individual like me or like you. It must be based on happiness of everybody, that must be aggregated, that must be collectivized, and then after, on the basis of that, we should decide what is moral or what is not. Further, write down further. While calculating this happiness, we must give equal importance to while calculating this happiness, while calculating this happiness, we must give equal value to the happiness of everyone. You must give equal value to the happiness of everyone. In his theory, write down further. In his theory, the happiness of a beggar is as important as that of a king. Happiness of a beggar is as important as the happiness of a king. This makes his theory an objective impartial and non-judgmental theory of ethics. Objective, impartial and non-judgmental theory of ethics. Now, this is the next important thing. The idea here is that what he says here is that when we calculate this happiness of everybody, then we must give equal value to the happiness of everybody, regardless of who that person is. So, everybody's happiness is equally important, equally valuable. Suppose, for example, what I mean here is something like this. Suppose, for example, these are the people whose happiness we are aggregating here. Suppose this person, first person I am talking about, suppose he is a king, and suppose this person is a beggar. Suppose this person is a very rich person, he is a very poor person, he is an industrialist, he is a farmer, he is a laborer, whatever. So, a different part. The problem with us normally is that, Bentham will say, that we consider the happiness of some people as more important than the happiness of somebody else. So, we often consider happiness of a king is more important. King is king, he is a very powerful person, important person in the society. So, his happiness matters a lot. Beggars, on the other hand, they are poor people, they have no value. So, their happiness does not matter at all. We simply dismiss their happiness. Even if they die, you must have heard such disparaging statement about the poor people, that kutte ki tarah soega to kutte ki tarah marega. You must have heard such statements. It was a singer in Bollywood, can say in Mumbai film industry, Abhijit Sawant perhaps. He had said this when he was referring to the Salman Khan case a few years ago. When Salman Khan's car has killed 7 people on the pavements of Mumbai, and somebody asked this singer that what do you say about that case, then he simply did, oh, they were sleeping like dogs, so they died like dogs. Now 7 people died and you are comparing that with the death of dogs. So that is a type of dismissive attitude that people have towards the poor people. Bentham will say that is unethical. So you cannot dismiss the happiness of the people who are beggars, who are the poor people. Everybody's happiness is equally important. Happiness of a king is as important as the happiness of a beggar. In this sense, he was a hardcore Democrat. One man, one vote. He was a strong votary of such a situation. He said everybody's opinion in society must have an equal value. You cannot simply say king is more important, his opinion can say has a higher weightage, and we are the common people, our opinion, our happiness has a lower weightage. Everybody's happiness has an equal weightage according to him, equal potency according to him, equal value according to him. So in today's our country, we have a big VIP culture. A big VIP culture when that so VIP culture in which one minister passes through the road and you create a barricade and a large number of people get inconvenienced because of that. Bentham will say that is unethical. Just because this person is a minister does not mean that his happiness is more important, and just because we are the common people does not mean that our happiness does not matter. So our happiness is as important as the happiness of a minister. Though you can make a slightly complicated argument on Bentham's line, that you might possibly say that if the Prime Minister reaches his office on time, then he can make more people happier than I when I reach my classroom on time. If I reach my classroom on time, for example, then only these many people will become happier. And if the Prime Minister reaches his office on time, then he might make thousands of people happier by making a policy maybe. So, making a good policy maybe. On that ground, you can make some special preference from the Prime Minister, but not because the Prime Minister is more important and we are less important. Everybody is equally important as far as ethics is concerned, as far as values are concerned. So, that is the type of equality that he wants to maintain as far as the happiness is concerned. Because of that, he claimed that my theory of utilitarianism is an objective theory. Why it is objective? Because it does not differentiate between, it does not depend on the subject. It does not depend on whether you are a king or you are a beggar. So, it is equally applied on everybody. It is an objective theory, number one. Number two, it is an impartial theory, that it does not make favor to somebody. Bias is not bias, has a bias in favor of somebody like a king or bias against somebody like a beggar. Everybody is equal in the eye of his ethics. Impartial theory, but more importantly, it is a non-judgmental theory, because he says that we should not make a judgment about whose happiness is good and whose happiness is bad. Sometimes I will give you some more example of that in the next class. Some people have a very judgmental attitude that my happiness is good and yours is bad. So Bentham will say that you cannot know happiness is bad. Happiness is always good. Suppose, for example, suppose I get a lot of happiness in reading a book of philosophy, and suppose my daughter gets a lots of happiness in watching a cartoon, Simpson, Doraemon, or well, Ninja Hattori, whatever. She gets a lots of happiness in watching these cartoons. Now, if I tell her that, well, don't watch cartoons are bad, read philosophy is good, will that be the right thing to do? Bentham will say that will be wrong. Because if I get happiness in reading a book of philosophy, that happiness is as important as the happiness of my daughter who she gets in watching a cartoon. I have no right to tell her that your happiness is bad. Don't watch cartoon, that is a bad happiness. Read books of philosophy, that is a good happiness. No, there is nothing called gradation of happiness, good and bad. So her happiness which she gets in watching a Simpson, a cartoon for example, is as important as my happiness which I get in reading a book of philosophy maybe. This is what Bentham, everybody is equal. You should not make a judgment about the happiness of somebody. It is a non-judgmental theory of ethics. That is the thing. So these are the important characteristics of his theory that he claims to profess. Thus, change the paragraph and after write further. Now, this line that you are going to write next, it is the sort of summary of whole utilitarian philosophy. So, if somebody asks you to define utilitarianism, then this line that you are going to write, you should write. And you can use this line anywhere in your case study also, in your direct question also. Whenever we try to talk about utilitarian philosophy, then you can use this line as a definition of utility. Everything that we have talked about till now and everything else that we will talk about in the rest of the class today, well, all of that can be summarized in just single statement, this one. So, write down, thus that action is the right action. That action is the right action which produces the greatest happiness for the greatest number. That action is the right action which produces the greatest happiness for greatest number. Now, this is the thing, next one. He says that action is the right action which produces. The moment you use the term produces, you already go into the domain of consequence. Produces what? Well, greatest happiness for greatest number. Two variables are important here. First variable is number. So, calculate the number of people who are affected by your act. Like in this classroom, me as well as all my students. And then after, calculate happiness for each of them, multiply the two. Whatever is the result of that, will be the measure of morality, will be the total happiness, will be the collective happiness. We often call that as principle of GHGN. Greatest happiness for greatest number. I will use this term a number of times in my later classes also. You can use that principle of greatest. So this theory is actually known as sometimes principle of the greatest happiness for greatest number. So these are the two important. Numbers are important in his theory and happiness is important. Both of them must be aggregated. Both of them must be put together in a framework. So finally, if you look at this formula that we have talked about, that happiness was equal to pleasure minus pain. Now you can give it a final shape by adding a symbol like this one, sigma. What is that sigma? It is summation. Summation also calculate the pleasure of all, calculate pain for all of us, and subtract the two and sum it up. That summation will be the total happiness. That should be the standard of morality. That should be the norm of morality. That should be the criteria of moral judgment. So this is the theory of utilitarianism in a way. Greatest happiness for greatest number. Not my happiness, not your happiness. Everybody's happiness must be taken into consideration by weighing them equally, by giving all of them equal value. So without making a judgment about whose happiness is good and whose is bad. So this is how he will say that moral judgment can be arrived at. Now before we proceed to the next important part of his theory, let us take a small example that will help you to understand how this theory can be applied in the more practical situations. So let's take a small case. Suppose for example, you are a working person, and suppose one day you are going to your office, and also suppose that you are very late for your office. Office time is 10 o'clock and it's already 11:30 maybe, and you know that some of your colleagues at your office are waiting for you. A very important project is being delayed because of your absence. So all of your colleagues are waiting only for you. Only when you reach office on time, if you can say, only when you will reach your office on time, then your colleagues along with you will go to complete the project. So all of them are just waiting for you, very angry at you, very irritated at you that yes, why are you so late? Why? Idea is that you are running towards your office, you want to reach your office as soon as you possibly can. Now suppose while going to your office, you pass through a deserted road, a lonely place, and there you find that somebody has met with an accident, a hit and run case. So that person is in a lonely place, that person is lying on the side of the road in a pool of blood waiting for somebody to help him to take to the hospital. Now also imagine that it is a pre-mobile era. You don't have the mobile that you can make a call to somebody and ask the help. So in this situation you have only two choices in front of you. One choice is that you can let that person die on the road and move ahead. You have very important work, project is important. People are waiting for you, your work is delayed. So that is one choice you can have. And the second choice that you have is that you can take some pain, you can bear the burden of the anger of your colleagues and all, stop there, help that person to take him to the hospital and try to save the life of that person. So second choice in front of you is that you can help that person. Now the question here is that in this situation, helping that victim of accident, is that morally justified or not? Is that morally justified or not? Now in this case, should you help that person or not? Now when I ask this question in my class, then everybody in the classroom says, sir, yes sir, we should help that person. Perhaps all of you will say the same thing. So should I help or not? Maybe you will say, yes, we should. But Bentham will say, no, hold on. You cannot make a judgment like that. Remember, first line that I made you to write in this theory was that, what? No action is right or wrong in itself. So no action is right or wrong in itself. Well, so helping is neither right nor it is wrong. Nothing is right and nothing is wrong in itself. Helping is neither right nor it is wrong. Now, if it is neither right and nor it is wrong, how can you decide about the morality? Well, Bentham will say, make a utilitarian calculation. How can you make a utilitarian calculation? Well, first of all, count the number of people who are affected by your act and happiness for each of them. So, in this case, the first person who will be affected by your act will be the victim himself. Remember, we are trying to evaluate the morality of help. Is help moral or not? That is what we are going to judge. So, First person who will be affected by your act of helping will be the victim, and for him a lot of happiness will be created. His life might possibly be saved because of your act of helping. Who are the other people affected in this case? Maybe your family members. So their family member, the victim's family member, they will also get a lot of happiness because their family, one member of their family might possibly be saved. Who are the other people? Maybe you yourself. You will have to pay some cost for that. Again, you may have to suffer a little. What can be the suffering? Well, you may have to suffer because your friends will become angry at you. You will have to bear the anger of your friends. You may have to forego, your project will be delayed. You may have to forego your promotion maybe because of that, or some immediate cost you may have to pay. You have to pay, spend some money in the petrol and diesel cost in order to take that person to the hospital. Your car may get soiled, your clothes may get soiled. You may have to go to the hospital and spend some time there, some hassles in the hospital, police hassles later on. So all these things will be there. Calculate all of that. But keep one basic thing in mind. While calculating this pain that you may have to suffer, do not give higher importance to your pain. Problem with us is that, Bentham will say, problem often with us is that we often consider our happiness as more important than the happiness of anyone else. And we often consider our pain as more important than the pain of anyone else. Bentham will say you cannot make that type of distinction. So don't think that your happiness, your pain or happiness is more important than that of the victim. Everybody's happiness must be evaluated equally. So don't think that it is your pain that you are thinking about. Think that you are a third person, maybe an abstract observer. And as an abstract objective observer, you are looking at how much pain a third person has to bear if that person tries to help that victim to take him to the hospital. Being that objective, calculate your pain also. Add that up. Who are the other people? Maybe your colleagues. They will also become unhappy because they will become angrier still because of your continued absence. Who are the other people? Maybe all those people who are affected by your project. So they will also become unhappy. Make this list as exhaustive as you possibly can. Somebody asked me, sir, can we add the happiness of hospital people? They will make some business, chemists or medicine people and all. So add all of that if you want. But for the sake of simplicity here, let us assume that these are the only people who are affected by your act. So then after, sum it up together. In this case, it appears that plus is more than the minus. If the plus is more than the minus, then it will give a positive value to your acts helping, and help will become right, and you must help that victim even if sometimes you have to suffer a little pain. But remember, helping is not always right. Helping can become wrong also. When can it become wrong? Suppose, for example, the project that is being delayed because of your absence is a very important project. So it is very important. Suppose, for example, it is the launching of a rocket, and suppose you are the chief scientist. So if you are further late, then only when you reach the office on time, then launching can be done. If you are further late, then launching of the rocket may be postponed, and that will have a serious consequence for ISRO and the government or the public. Or more practically, suppose this project that we are talking about, suppose this project is the defusal of a bomb, and you are the police, you are a police officer, head of the bomb disposal squad of your city. In the morning, you get an information that somebody had planted a bomb somewhere in your city, and this bomb is going to blast very soon. And you are the most expert person, only you have the technical expertise, know-how to defuse the bomb. So your colleagues are waiting only for you. Only when you reach the office on time, then along with you, your colleagues will go to defuse the bomb. If you are late further, then bomb may blast and it may have a serious consequence for the public, for the society. In this case, do you think that you should stop and help that person? All of you will say that no, it is not. So Bentham will also say that no, it is not, because in this case the project is so important that, well, instead of plus, the total consequence will become negative. So in this case, we can say that this negative consequence will give a negative value to the helping, and helping can become wrong. So in this case, Bentham will say that, well, forget about that person, let him die. Unfortunately, he might possibly die also, but your work is important, go ahead and do your work. A problem with us is that, Bentham will say, problem with us is that we often, you can say, while making a moral decision, we often take decisions on the basis of sentiments, maybe impulse, maybe that suddenly the moment we can say we get a situation, we jump to the conclusion, this is what I can do. So the moment somebody asks you that should I be on time in the classroom or not, we jump to the conclusion, yes, I should be on time, without thinking, without calculating. Or the moment somebody asks us a question that, well, should I speak truth to that old lady in the hospital or not, we jump to the conclusion, you must speak the truth. Or somebody asks, should I help that person on the road or not, we jump to the conclusion, I should help. Now Bentham will say that we cannot make a moral judgment on the basis of such sentiments. Sentiments are a big impediment in the moral judgment according to him. So he will say that in such a situation, every time when you have to make a judgment, you must make a proper calculation. You must think before you act. And thinking is what? You must think in terms of the consequence. That your act is, well, what is the consequence that is going? Same act can become right sometimes, can become wrong sometimes, depending on the consequence. So helping may be right in the first case and helping may be wrong in the second case. That is what Bentham will say. You must always make a proper utilitarian calculation, objective calculation, impartial calculation by being non-judgmental, well, and then only on the basis of that calculation we should make a judgment decision about what is right and what is wrong. We should not jump to the conclusion on the basis of whim and fancy. This is what he will say. So that is how his idea can be applied in the practical cases like this. Now before we proceed further, let us see, there are many questions that are there. So let us take these questions before we further. There was a question, sir, therefore the perception of happiness will differ according to Bentham as a social related pleasure and pain will be different from individual perspective. We will handle this question next topic. Shubhasri, Sujit, sir, hedonistic aspect is totally based on happiness it seems. Sir, here happiness is in overall term or happiness of individual. As you got the answer already. Final test we have already seen. Sir, what is happiness? Since happiness is very subjective, then how is it the theory objective? We'll talk about that shortly, but remember here happiness must be measured. As we'll talk about that also question will be take up next topic. Sir, I can't be happy. I can't make write proper sentence, Biswajit. I can't happy everyone with my act. Someone happy, someone unhappy by my act. Write proper sentence. That will be a good practice that you can do for your writing. Don't write a social media type of message. So you can type a few more words to make your sentence complete and clear. In the first day itself, I told you that your language must be clear. So don't write incorrect sentence without verb. By act, so that the person has to think in order to understand your answer question. I can't happy everyone with my act, someone happy, someone unhappy by my act, then which one considered as happiness? I hope that you got the answer, that some will become unhappy, some will become happy. Calculate total. If total happiness is more than the total unhappiness, then the action is right. And if the total unhappiness is more than the total happiness, then the action will be wrong. Shubhankar, sir, most of the time happiness compels us to do and pain compels us to don't. But there are instances when pain compels us to do as well. Could you explain this a bit more? Yes, Shubhankar, pain also can compel us, but that doing will be avoidance of something. So pain makes us to suppose for example, if I have pain in my headache, then it will compel me to go to a doctor and seek help. So that I am doing. That still is moral act, because that will, so any action that reduces the pain is to be done, and anything that increases the pain is to increases the pleasure is to be done. So pain can make you to do also, but that doing will be to avoid the pain. So that will also become the moral act. Next question, sir, as far as collective happiness is concerned, what if it makes a portion of half happy but not the other half? Well, exactly half and other half will not be there. There will be some, so there has to be better comparison in that case. Exact half may be next to impossible. If it is exact half, then well, there is no judgment. You can do either of the two. There is no choice in that case. Next question, Kaushik. If anyone feels happy for doing any crime, then how non-judgmental part of this theory works, sir? If anyone feels happy for doing a crime, then will that crime create unhappiness for others? I think that you have not understood the whole thing. Try to understand the concept first of all. So crime always makes a criminal happy, but it creates a lot of victim unhappy. We have to take into consideration total happiness, not the criminal's happiness. Isn't it? So if we aggregate that, then crime always creates more unhappiness rather than the happiness. So it is not done. Next question, Vidisha Sarkar. Sir, isn't that this whole concept very hypothetically, because no policy or decision can ever be made everyone happy? I did not say everyone happy. I said greatest number of people happier, majority of the people. So everyone, again, don't try to put word into the mouth of Bentham. He is very clear about that. Everyone, nobody can make everyone happy. So some people will become unhappy, some people will become happy. You have to calculate total of that. And total will determine. So in this case, somebody will subtracted also unhappiness, and happiness can be added. Isn't it? So I did not say everyone happy. No, nobody can make everyone happy. It is the majority of the people, maximum number. Number is important. Number does not mean that everyone. Isn't it? Braja, next question. Sir, ministers are happy to corrupt money and sold flats to keep money. So according to Bentham theory, if minister is happy, again write good grammatical sentence. Complete grammar. Your sentences are grammatically very confusing. So according to Bentham's theory, if minister is happy, then we are happy. So ED and CBI need to give freedom to our ministers from jail. Who say that minister is happy, then we are happy. If minister become corrupt, then we all become unhappy. Do you become happy because your minister is corrupt? It will create a lot of unhappiness for a large number of other people. So again, think before you ask the question. I have repeated it a number of times that one person's happiness is not important. It is the happiness of total. So if some people, ministers, become corrupt and at the cost of your cost, would you become happy that my minister is happy, so let me suffer? If you think that everybody will be like that, so that's a very absurd thing. Sujit. Sir, at one hand, we are stating that this theory is impartial, but on the other hand, it is partially support the greatest happiness or greatest number. Isn't it little vague? No, it is not. What if the act is morally wrong, but it causes happiness for the greatest number? According to this theory, Sujit, according to this theory, well, happiness alone is the morality. So if it is creating maximum number of people happy, it cannot be immoral. That is the definition of morality in this theory. So that will make that act automatically moral. So it is not vague, it is a very clear theory in that sense. Next question, Nimai. Sir, humanity says helping someone is right act and we should do right act, but according to Bentham, no action is right or wrong. We measure consequence. So which one we should do? Nimai, what do you think that in that second case, do you think that you should help that victim and let the bomb blast somewhere else? Just think about it logically. I don't think that you will agree with anybody who goes against this theory, isn't it? So, should you help one person on the road and let the bomb blast in a city where 100 people may die? You have to make a choice sometimes. You cannot do both of them together. So, you have to make a choice which is better and which is not. So, next one, Anirban. So, sometimes it's very hard to determine the consequence of action during making a decision. If someone's honest decision leads to bad consequence, then as per utilitarianism, how can that person be unethical? Well, try to make your calculation better. We'll talk about that later on, how can it be done, Anirban. But try to make your calculation better. What type of question we'll ask from this section in our exam? Understand the theory first of all. Question, don't worry about that. Again, you are jumping the gun. Pin 2. Subrata, sir, when we start to calculate that happiness of all, it takes a lot of time. Sometimes we don't have such much time. We'll talk about that also later. Subham, sir, suppose in a case where because of me 4 people are being happy and 4 people are being unhappy, what should the help be declared, positive or negative? If it is exactly same, again calculate the amount of happiness for each of them. If it is exactly same, then there is no moral choice, you can do any of them. If it is equal, then you can do any of them. If it is more and less, then you have to decide more or less. But if it is equal for all, then it is up to you to decide. You can toss a coin maybe. Even that can help maybe. So that is the thing. Lots of questions, but try to understand the theory first. Most of these questions are simply the result of not understanding what we have talked about here. So try to understand the idea first of all and then evaluate yourself before you ask the question. Now let's talk about the next important thing. Change the paragraph and then after write further. Bentham proposed a science of morality Bentham proposed a science of morality in which all types, or before we talk about further, tell me one thing, when we say science of morality, tell me one thing before we write further. When we talk about science of morality or science of anything for that matter, science of physics or chemistry or psychology or sociology or economics, etc., whenever we talk about the science of something, then what exactly is it that science means? Where does the science begin? What is the most fundamental difference between science and non-science? Now, this is an interesting question. When I ask this question in my classroom, then many students, offline classroom, physical classroom, then a number of students tell that different things are rationality, objectivity or experimentation or observation of fact, explanation, utility, benefit, whatever you can. So, many students talk about many things. All of these things are, well, not something that alone defines science. Science is defined by one central criteria. We often say that science begins with, first of all, measurement or quantification. So, science begins with measurement or quantification. This is what we often say. Just think of it that in your school days, in your 5th standard, for example, how did you define force? You might have remembered. We defined force there as a type of push and pull. Now, if you define force as a push and pull, then that is not science. That is more like philosophy, because push and pull is a very vague term. There is no definition, there is no exact meaning of that term. Now, what Newton did, Newton said that we cannot measure force. Of course, force is a very vague thing, very unclear thing maybe. So, we cannot measure force. But what he said, that what I can do is that I can establish a correlation between force which cannot be measured and two other variables like m and a, mass and acceleration, which can be measured. The moment Newton did that, the moment Newton established a correlation between force which cannot be measured and mass and acceleration which can be measured, then he established the study of force as a science. Before him, the study of force was philosophy. After him, well, study of force became science. So, science, we often say, begins with the measurement. The moment you start measuring a particular variable, you establish the study of a new science. So, when Newton measured force, then physics became a science. Before Newton, physics was a part of philosophy. We used to call that as natural philosophy. He established physics as a science. Similarly, when economists say that we can measure the economic variables, then economics became a science. When sociologists say that we can measure the social fact, then sociology became a science. When psychologists say that we can measure the psychological facts like mental phenomena or behavior, etc., then psychology became a science. So, the moment you measure a particular variable, we establish a new science in that case. And Bentham also meant the same thing when he talked about the science of morality. So, write down further. Bentham proposed a science of morality in which all types of happiness can be measured, in terms of seven variables. All types of happiness can be measured in terms of 7 variables. He called this method of measurement of happiness. He called this method of measurement of happiness as the hedonistic calculus. He called this method of measurement of happiness as hedonistic calculus. Now, this was another very important and perhaps a very original contribution of Bentham in the moral philosophy. He said here that, well, morality must be a science. he claimed that morality can be a science. He was the first person perhaps in history who claimed that morality can be a science. Everybody thinks that morality must be philosophy. Morality must be about speculation and all. But he claimed that no, morality can be a science, as pure a science as physics or chemistry can possibly be. So this is what he claimed, this is what he suggested, this is what we try to do. So he said that morality can be a science. In order to make a science of morality, what we can do, we have to measure the moral variable. What is that moral variable? Happiness. So he said that happiness must be measured in terms of 7 variables. Now this method of measurement of happiness he called as hedonistic calculus. So just as he claimed that Newton has measured force in terms of 2 variables, so we can measure happiness also in terms of 7 variables. Now I will not go into the detail of those 7 variables here. That is true, you can say nobody believes in that 7 variable today. These variables are something like intensity, duration, propinquity or fecundity. So yeah, many such vague and very unique terms are there that he had used for this thing. I will not go into the detail of that, but so nobody believes in that today. But this idea that morality can be a science and this idea that happiness can be measured, happiness can be quantified is a very important idea in the modern philosophy. We will talk a lot about that in the next class, that how do we calculate and measure happiness in the modern time. We will talk about that also in our class later on. So this is the one important thing. So in a way we can say he had said just before him, well, he was a philosopher or you can say professor or legal expert in London. Just before him, a few decades before him, well, Newton was also there in London. And Newton is often known as you know, as a father of physics today, modern physics. So Newton had, so Bentham also claimed, just as Newton is considered as the father of physics, just as Newton actually invented calculus to you can say make a good calculation or accurate and more exact calculation of the physical variables. Similarly, he said that I have invented the calculus, hedonistic calculus, to measure the happiness. Just as Newton is considered as a science of physics, similarly he claimed that I should also be considered as a science of father of the science of morality. He had this ambition to become Newton of morality. You know, Newton had a strong influence of many of those philosophers at that time. One of the important influence of Newton was this also. So this is what he tried to do in that case. So that is the idea of the hedonistic calculus of Bentham. Right now I will stop at it only in this topic, but remember I will come back to this quantification and measurement of happiness in the next class. Well, I will talk about how Bentham supporters today try to measure happiness, in what term. How can we quantify happiness, how can we measure happiness, how can we calculate happiness. So that is one important thing. Next one, write down further. Last important point of his theory. According to Bentham, utilitarianism is not just a theory of individual action. It is not just a theory of individual action, but it can also be the theory of our economic and political actions as well. It can also be the basis of our economic and political actions as well. It can also be the basis of our economic and political actions as well. It can be the basis of, write down further, it can be the basis of political and legal reform It can be the basis of the political and legal reform in a country as well. Political and legal reform in a country as well. So, that is the next important thing that we are talking. In this paragraph that you have written here, what Bentham is doing, he is trying to expand the scope of utilitarianism. He says that this theory is a very good theory of individual action. When we have to decide about your individual action, then like for example, should I be on time in this classroom or not? Should I speak truth to that old lady in the hospital or not? Should I help that person on the road or not? So, whenever I have to decide about such individual actions, then he said that I must take into consideration utilitarian theory again. That should be the basis of my decision. But the scope of this theory is not limited only to the individual action. It can be expanded to our economic action as well. Suppose for example, I want to start a new business and I am confused what is the good business and what is the bad, what is right and what is wrong. Then Bentham will say that my theory can help you. That start that business which creates maximum happiness for maximum number of people in the society. So, that business is good business which makes more people happier. That business will be a bad business which will make less people less happier. So, our economy, in any other way also economics can be influenced, that we will talk about later on. But economic actions also should be influenced by, should be determined by the utilitarian calculation only. Not only that, he said that this theory can be the basis of our political action as well. This theory can be, he claimed, the basis of the political and legal reform in a country as well. So, as we will see shortly, he was one of the most important legal reformer of his time, that strongly supported how legal reform can be actually, objectively, how legal reform can be actually done in the society. So, before his impact on these things, let us talk about first of all, how legal reform can be actually done in the society. So, what should be the basis of legal and political reform? Change the paragraph and then after write further. Write on further. Thus, before making any law, every legislature must ask that question. Before making any law, every legislature must ask this question, that whether the proposed law will create more happiness, for more number of people, than any of its alternative. If yes, then it is a good law. Otherwise, it is a bad law. If yes, then it is a good law. Otherwise, it is a bad law. If yes, then it is a good law. Otherwise, it's a bad law. Now, this is what he will say. He says here that before making any law, every legislature, like the parliament for example, must ask this question, that this proposed law that we are going to discuss here, well, will it make more people more happy than any other law in its place? Alternative law. If it is creating more happiness, then that is a good law. If it is not creating that much of happiness, then that will be a bad law. So, according to him, this is the only way to determine the morality of an act, morality of a law. Now, let's take that how this can be actually implemented in many cases. Suppose for example, in our country for the last few years, there have been lots of controversy about many law. For example, just a few years ago, last year maybe, well, there was so much of controversy was there about farm law. It created so much of disturbance, so much of trouble, so much of agitation against or in favor of the law. Or a few years earlier further, there was a law bill that was proposed by the Modi government, well, land acquisition law bill. So it created so much controversy. 4 times the ordinance were brought up, but finally no consensus was arrived at and the law was allowed to be lapsed. So both of these two laws ultimately failed, farm law as well as land acquisition law. Now, if there is a controversy like this, whether this law is land acquisition, let's take the case of land acquisition bill. Was that a good bill or a bad bill? Bentham will say, well, you can use my theory to understand, our idea to understand whether this law was a good law or a bad law. How can you decide that? Well, suppose for example, Bentham will say, let's take that law, say proposed law, the NDA law. How can you decide whether this NDA law is a good law or a bad law? Well, in this case, perhaps calculate, Bentham will say, calculate the total cost of that law and calculate the total benefit of that law. How can you calculate the cost first of all? Well, calculate the total number, count the total number of people who are going to be possibly affected by the bill in a negative manner, negative effect on the people. So, if the bill becomes a law, then first people who will be affected by the farmers maybe, because their land, farmland may be acquired for the industrial development. So, farmers may pay a cost, or who are the other people? Maybe the farm laborers, maybe they will lose their farm job, agricultural job, or rural people, rural area will shrink further, or uneducated people, lower class people, they will simply get, you can say, less opportunity for their employment and all that traditional employment that they had there in the farm sector maybe. On the other hand, make this list as exhaustive. Similarly, you can say calculate what are the benefits. Who will get the benefit? Number one, well, industrialists, they will have easy availability of land for industrial development. Who are the other people? Well, the urban people, urban area will expand, urban lifestyle will expand further. Or who are the other people? Maybe middle class people, or you can say educated people, upper class people. They will get better employment opportunities in the modern industries and all. So, make this list as exhaustive as possible, both plus and the minus. But while Bentham will say one very important thing here, that when you make this calculation, then you can say you must give equal importance to the happiness of everyone, whoever that person is. So, problem with us is that we often consider the happiness of those people who are closer to us as more important than the happiness of people who are not so close. So, suppose for example, one person commits suicide from upper class or middle class maybe in an urban city, for example, Sushant Singh Rajput for example, then it becomes big news and months people keep on talking about that. On the other hand, there are hundreds of farmers in a village, well, they commit suicide every month, every year, well, that does not create much trouble for the people. Bentham will say that would be unethical. Suicide of a poor farmer in a village is as bad as the suicide of Sushant Singh Rajput. You cannot say that his suicide is big, you can say very bad, and that suicide is not that bad. We cannot ignore that, and we cannot give higher preference to everybody must be equally evaluated. So, whether that person is Sushant Singh Rajput or that person is a poor farmer in the village, both of them are equally important as far as the value of their suicide is concerned. So, you should be that equal. So, in this case calculation, happiness of a poor farmer is as important as the happiness of a Ambani and Adani. You cannot consider that their happiness is more important, they are the big people, and their happiness is less important, they are the small people. No, nobody is big or small in eye of ethics. So, being that objective, well, calculate the total happiness for all, and well, thereafter compare the two. If the benefits are more than the cost, then that will be a good law, pass the law. And if the cost is more than the benefit, then well, that is a bad law, change the law, amend the law. So, this is the only way that we can decide whether the law is good or bad, only on the basis of the calculation of the consequence of the law for the people in the future consequence result. So that is the only way he said that law can be evaluated whether the law is a good law or a bad law. Now you may possibly say that this is a little commonsensical. This is what the parliament does even today. Whenever a bill is passed in the parliament, then normally what should happen, that debate happens, though debate is very rare these days, but technically there should be a debate. In that debate, a ruling party often talks about the benefits of the proposed law and the opposition party often talks about the cost of the proposed law. So that is what happens. So in that situation you can say, and if the benefits are found to be better more than the cost, then we pass the law, otherwise we amend the law. That is what we normally do. But it is not that commonsensical, because in reality what happens, very often laws are made not on the basis of such calculation but on the basis of many other factors. Like for example, sometimes very often the laws are made on the basis of the whim and fancy of the ruling class, of the king, for example. Suddenly one day the king gets up early in the morning and something happens in his mind and he passes a decree, and that decree becomes the law. And because of such whimsical law, a large number of people in the society get inconvenienced. Perhaps in traditional India, the best example of this could be the case of, say, Muhammad bin Tughlaq. You must have heard his case. Now Muhammad bin Tughlaq, suddenly one day it happened to him that he thought that he decided that capital of his kingdom must be taken from Delhi to Daulatabad. And he decreed that every person from Delhi, with all their livestock, with all their property, with all their animals, etc., should go to Daulatabad. Everybody moved there. And when they started to settle there, then it was found that not enough water was available there. Then he again decreed that everybody has to come back to Delhi. Everybody returned. And during in this forced migration and in migration, well, a large number of people died. Bentham will say it is unethical. You cannot make law on the basis of whim and fancy of the king of the ruling class. We often call in India Tughlaqi Farman. So that has become whimsical law. So such farman, such law are unethical. It is not only an ancient time. Even today you can find similar example. Suddenly suppose at 8 o'clock in the evening, the king appears on television and he tells that, yeah, from 12 o'clock in the night, your money will not be your money. Or suddenly at 8 o'clock, that demonetization decision. Or someday again 8 o'clock, the king appears on the television and he tells you that from 12 o'clock in the night, well, everybody in the country must stay where they are. Stop moving. So suddenly you stop the whole nation. Now, was that, Bentham will say that, was that properly evaluated? Did you make a calculation at how much inconvenience will it create for how many people? So idea here is that we cannot make decision on the basis of such whim and fancy. You must make a proper calculation before arriving at a judgment, before arriving at a decision. So very often you can say in the history everywhere in the world that many laws are made on the basis of the personal preference of the ruler, whim and fancy. Now there are other criteria on which normally we make the law is also the custom of the society. Custom or convention. So one criteria of making law is whim and fancy. Second criteria of law making in many society, throughout history including today also, are customs and the conventions of the society. So many people believe, many philosophers, many thinkers, many politicians, many common people also, they believe that law must be made in such a manner to preserve the custom of the society, convention of the society, tradition of the society. Law should not try to change the custom and all. Such people who believe that law must be the reflection of the custom and convention of the society, they are called conservatives. So they are called conservative. Who are the conservative people? Politicians or philosophers? Well, conservative people are the ones who believe that purpose of the law is to conserve the tradition or custom of the society. So law must not try to tinker with the tradition and custom. Law must always allow the custom to evolve rather than to forcefully change by the legislation. Law must not interfere into the social convention. Such people are called conservative people. So, that was a time when Bentham was there in the 18th century. Then you can say these conservative philosophers were very strongly powerful. You must have heard the name of such conservative philosophers like, say, Edmund Burke. Some of you may have heard the name of Edmund Burke. Edmund Burke was perhaps the most influential conservative philosopher. So, there are a large number of other philosophers have been there. There are a large number of politicians have been there who are conservatives by their political orientation, by their moral orientation maybe. Now, people like Bentham were strongly against such conservative people. Bentham and his supporters thought that these conservative people are the stupid people. They simply do not think about what is right and wrong. They simply think, okay, something that was there, it must always remain. We should not try to change the society. No, change is the law of nature. You must change the society. And how the change can be done? Well, on the basis of utilitarian calculation. So, he was strongly against whimsical law as well as conservative law. He was the person who supported what we call legal reform. He said the state must always try to reform the society through law, by making law. So, and how can the reform be done? On the basis of such utilitarian calculation. So, every custom that exists in the society, it must be evaluated on the basis of utilitarian calculation. If the custom is beneficial for the society, it should be retained. If it is not beneficial, we should change that. So, we should not accept custom just because they are the custom. We should not accept the tradition just because they are tradition. You must always, keep on evaluating them. Are they still creating same consequence that it may have created in the past? So, is it still beneficial for the society? Only that should be the ground on which laws should be made, not on the ground of convention or the tradition. So, as I told you earlier also that Bentham was one of the most important reformer, legal reformer of his time in the whole world. So, in his book, the name of the book that he wrote here, on the basis of which our class is based, name of the book itself is The Principles of Morals and Legislation. So, he thought that the principles of morality must lead to the legislation. And what is the principle of morality? Utilitarian principle. So, only on the basis of utilitarian calculation, principle of morality, we should make the legislation, we should make the law. In that book, he has given a long list of such law in Britain which he thought are unethical law. And he also suggested how can we make this law better, how can we reform this law. So, he has very extensively talked about reform in the prison law, jail reform, traffic law reform. So, at many places different types of law he said that how the reform can be done. And in order to do the reformation of the law, we must make the codification of the law. Law must be properly codified so that we can make a calculation. Laws are very vague sometimes. So, he was a strong supporter of codification of the law. So much so that at that was the time, because of this idea, he sort of became an international celebrity of that time. He was invited by the French government after the French Revolution and all to codify the French law also. And that codification of French law by Bentham became so important, so influential and popular that he was invited by the Queen of Russia also, to codify the Russian law. And his book became one of the best seller of that time. Everybody who thought about the politics and law used to take ideas from Bentham for that. Now, Bentham's idea of reform of the law had a strong impact even on India of that time, because that was the time when India was under the British rule. So, if you look at British rule in India, then from this point of view, we can divide the British rule in India in three parts. Think of it, three ways, three parts. Suppose, for example, this is time. Then we can divide the British rule into three time frame. First phase was of British rule was the phase of conservative. That was the time when people like conservative philosophers like Edmund Burke, etc., were extremely influential. Were very much influential about their, I can say, about their influence. So, initial East India Company administrators were strongly influenced by the people like Edmund Burke, conservatives like Edmund Burke. And so, what they did, they tried to understand first of all Indian custom and tradition, and they thought that Indian administration must be run on the basis of Indian custom and tradition. Because of that, they made a very conscious effort to understand Indian tradition, Indian culture, Indian law, etc. In these cases, again, people like William Jones played a very important role. You must have heard the name of William Jones. So William Jones was the person, well, he was the person, he is one of the founders of the Asiatic Society, you may be aware of that. But important thing about William Jones was that he was the first Englishman who learned Sanskrit. So he learned Sanskrit, and then after he translated many ancient Sanskrit texts into English like Manu Smriti, Bhagavad Gita, Abhigyan Shakuntalam. So he translated many of such books in English, and that these translated books in English became rage in Europe at that time. It is said that when he translated Abhigyan Shakuntalam of Kalidas into English and it was published in Europe, then it created a storm in Europe. People in Europe were shocked by looking at it. Such a great work of literature was present in the ancient India also. So much so that people started comparing Kalidas, author of Abhigyan Shakuntalam, with Shakespeare. Shakespeare is considered to be the greatest author in the English language. So people started comparing Kalidas with Shakespeare. Many of them said that Kalidas was the Shakespeare of India. We might say the reverse, the Shakespeare was the Kalidas of Britain maybe, but this type of comparison was made at that time. So these people were quite appreciative of the Indian tradition or culture or something like this one. That was the first phase. Now second phase was the phase of reform. That was the time when Bentham and his ideas became extremely influential. So Bentham actually inspired his friend James Mill. We will talk about him maybe in the next class. So he inspired his friend James Mill to try to codify the Indian law. He inspired further, he looked at Lord Macaulay, who came to India, and he was the person, Lord Macaulay, under the influence of Bentham and Mill, he codified the Indian law, and IPC and CRPC was written. Just as Bentham codified the French law, so Lord Macaulay codified the Indian law. We still are using that codified law, IPC or CRPC, with some reform from time to time. So he did that. Now that was the time when these reformers became very dismissive of the ancient Indian tradition. So they thought that we are not here to talk about Indian tradition, we have to reform the society, as Bentham said. So you must have heard that famous quotation of Lord Macaulay. He had said that all the books of ancient India, all the texts of ancient India is not worth even a single rag in a library in Britain. So it is all rubbish that India has. So forget about all the Indian books and all. Let us reform India. Let us make a better law here. So this is what they tried to impose, the reformation that they thought was good. And in this reform push that was supported by Bentham, well, many Indian reform leaders also played a very important role in that. Most importantly, Raja Ram Mohan Roy. So Raja Ram Mohan Roy, if you look at it, he was a personal friend of Bentham, not only an intellectual, you can say colleague. He was a personal friend of Bentham. When he went to London, for example, then he had a personal meeting with him also. They have long correspondence also. In fact, Bentham was the first person who wrote to Raja Ram Mohan Roy that why don't you take the lead in reforming the Indian law. So these people were actually strongly influenced by the ideas of Bentham. Because of that, these leaders, like you can say Raja Ram Mohan Roy, they ran a movement against sati, for example, and many reform movement happened. Sati was abolished, or widow remarriage was allowed, or you can say the Dalit education was allowed. So all these things happened because of the reform push of Bentham and his philosophy. So it has a strong impact on these things. All those Indian reform leaders also, like Raja Ram Mohan Roy, Ishwarchand Vidyasagar, or Jyotiba Phule, or all these people, they were strongly influenced by similar ideas that Bentham was proposing at that point of time. So that was the second phase of Bentham in a way. And third phase of British India started in 1857. It started in 1857. Now, revolt of 1857, all of you know, was a big blow to the British rule in India. British has become extremely afraid of, well, such further revolt and all. And many of them thought that one of the major cause of the revolt was the dissatisfaction that such a fast-paced reform created among Indians. What was the immediate trigger of the revolt of 1857? All of you know about that. It was the Enfield rifle cartridge. So soldiers were expected to use the Enfield rifle, in which the cartridge, it was rumored that the cartridges had the beef and pork, and which violated the sensibilities of both Hindus as well as Muslims. So it created a lot of this, and Britishers said, we don't care for your sensibilities. It is good, it is beneficial, it must be done. So what is good must be done, and what is bad must be avoided. We don't care whether you like it or not. So they created that force on that, and that created lots of dissatisfaction among the soldiers, and revolt happened. But it was not only soldiers' revolt; it had a widespread support in the Indian society also. So many Britishers thought that such a fast-paced reform actually created so much of dissatisfaction among the common people in India that this revolt got so much of popular support. So because of that, all of that, after 1857, they slowed down the reform. Then after they decided that our purpose in India is not to reform India. Our purpose in India is to rule India and to take maximum advantage of India. Then after they forgot the reform became at the back burner, and they started using all those policies that we know, divide and rule, Hindus and Muslims, etc. But this was second phase, was the phase of Bentham, when reform was a big focus of the administration of Britain in India also. So the idea is that Bentham's idea had been at that time that political reform must be done, was an extremely influential idea, not only in Britain but everywhere, Britain or in rest of the Europe or USA, America, India, everywhere this idea had a strong influence on the way political activity and legal reform, etc. was done since that time till today. So that was the impact of Bentham in a way. If you look at the whole idea of Bentham that we have been talking about here, that we often today talk about the welfare state. We often talk about the welfare state. Now, when we talk about welfare state, then we can say the basic philosophical idea behind the welfare state was Bentham's theory. That he was the person who said that the most important role of the state, purpose of the state, is to do the welfare of the people. And what is the meaning of the welfare? How can you define welfare? Same principle. Welfare is that activity that makes maximum number of people happier in the society, greatest happiness for greatest number. So the state must always try to create maximum happiness for greatest number of people in the society. That should be the purpose of a state. A state must always try to maximize the happiness of the society. This maximization of the happiness of the society is what we call the welfare. So a state must always do the welfare of the majority of the people, as many as of them we possibly can. Bahujan Hitay, Bahujan Sikhai, as we call in Hindi. So that was the idea of Bentham. Now till this point, if you think of it, then Bentham's theory was extremely influential. Let me see if there is a question. Shubhankar, sir, if ethics is so important for a democratic nation, don't you think that there must be a specific governing authority which can supervise the effective implementation of ethics in every action of the government? Yes, Shubhankar, but this we will talk about later. It's not related to this particular topic here. So let us focus only on the questions related to the topic. So next important thing is that, so till this point, if you look at it, Bentham's theory does appear to be a very appealing theory. Nobody can deny the importance and the role of this theory. But after that, we will see here that Bentham's theory is one of the most severely criticized theory of ethics as well. No theory of ethics has been criticized as severely as Bentham's theory. So in order to understand Bentham's idea well and the ethics in general, it's very important for us to understand the negative aspect of his theory. His theory is so strongly criticized that many modern philosophers think that his theory is such a bad theory that it should not be even considered as the theory of ethics altogether. Now, why is it that people think that his theory should not be called a theory of ethics? Let's talk about that. So, change the paragraph and then after write further. Criticism of utilitarianism. Criticism of utilitarianism. Criticism of utilitarianism. Now, theoretically you see, technically there are many criticisms are there. We will not talk about all of them in our class. Here we will talk about two very important criticisms which are relevant for our practical purposes and all. So, we will talk about two important criticism of Bentham's theory. First one, write down. First one, individual rights versus common good. Now write down a few lines firstly. According to Bentham, there is nothing like an absolute and categorical individual or natural rights. There is nothing like an absolute and categorical individual or natural rights. There is nothing like an absolute and categorical individual or natural rights. Now, this is the first important thing that we have to talk about. Today also, today more so, there are many people, including in our country, who are often strong supporter of what we call as, then we called as individual rights. Today we more often call that as human rights. So there are people who strongly support the ideas like human rights, etc. We often call them as human rights activists. They fight for the sake of human rights in the country. And these so-called human rights, there are many such people are there. All of you must be aware of people like Prashant Bhushan, Teesta Sittalvad, Sudha Bhardwaj, Barbara Rao, or Megha Patkar, Yogendra Yadav. So these are people who are often considered as the human rights activists. They are the people, they fight for the human rights in the country. Now these human rights activists are criticized by two groups of people. You may be aware of them. First group of people who criticize these human rights activists are the politicians. So politicians often accuse these human rights activists as being pro-terrorist, for example, pro-criminals, pro-Naxals, etc. Because these human rights activists often fight for the rights of the terrorists, rights of the criminal, rights of the Naxals, bad people in general. So it is these human rights activists, who get the Supreme Court opened in the middle of the night, 2 o'clock in the night, to get the hanging of a terrorist accused postponed early in the morning. Which case I am talking about? I hope that you remember that, perhaps Yaqub Menon case or Afzal Guru, maybe perhaps Yaqub Menon. Now Yaqub Menon was about to be hanged for his terrorist activities, involvement in the terrorist activity maybe, well, at 5 o'clock in the morning. Now at 2 o'clock, people like Prashant Bhushan and others, they filed a petition in the Supreme Court. They knocked at the door of the Supreme Court with a petition. And the Chief Justice of India had to hear that petition at 3 o'clock in the night. So a special session of Supreme Court happened. First time in the history of India when Supreme Court had to have a special session in middle of the night, 3 o'clock in the night, at the home of Chief Justice of India, when this petition was heard. And for what purpose? To get the hanging of a terrorist accused postponed in the morning. So idea here is that these human rights activists are often considered or accused being against supporters of the terrorists like those people. Again, their rights and all. They are often considered as anti-national or pro-terrorist or urban Naxal, Tugre gang, whatever you can see. So politicians often accuse these people, number one. Secondly, these people are also accused by, the economists. Economists often say that these human rights activists are, anti-development. Megha Patkar, for example, they oppose big developmental project in the name of human rights, tribals, rights of the tribal farmers, submergence of the land, etc. So they oppose big developmental project and they support the rights of the criminals. So economists and politicians often accuse them as being pro-terrorist or anti-development. Now, Bentham was one such person. He said that these people who are talking about human rights, they are all stupid people, sentimental people. So, he had said that human rights is a nonsense built upon stilt. It is a nonsense idea. It can never be supported on the basis of logic, according to him. He said that human rights is a nonsensical idea. It is a sentimental idea. Only sentimental people talk about human rights. They don't think, they feel. And remember, sentiment cannot be the basis of a science of morality. Science of morality must be non-sentimental. Sentiment should not have a place in a science. So, he was strongly against these so-called human rights activists. Now, individuals he did not, individual rights he did not like. Individuals are important in his theory. Write down further. For him, individuals are important, but for him, individuals are important, but only in the sense that the happiness and preference of each individual matter equally to that of anyone else. Beyond that, individuals do not matter. Beyond that, individuals do not matter. So, this is what he says. He says that individuals are important, no doubt about that. Individuals like me or like you. But what is my importance? What is your importance? Our importance is that we all contribute to that common pool of happiness. So, once we have made our contribution, then our importance as an individual is lost. We do not matter as an individual. Only till the point we are making a contribution to that total pool of happiness, that is, we are important. But once we have done that, then individuals like me or you do not matter. So, only importance of individual is the contribution of individual in the total happiness in the society. So, that is the only importance that individuals have. But, write on further, change the paragraph and then after write further. But according to his critiques, there are some individual rights which are so fundamental that they cannot be compromised, for any common good. They cannot be compromised for any common good, comma, however large that good is. However large that good is. So, the critics of Bentham will say, we will talk about these critics in tomorrow's class and the day after and the day after. But critics of Bentham will say that there are some individual rights or natural rights which are so important, so basic, so fundamental that they cannot be compromised for any common good, however large that good is. Now, that is an important thing. If you look at the history of ethics anywhere in the world, then in the history of ethics, there is one of the most persistent controversy has been this controversy, that what is more important, individual is more important or society is more important. individual is more important or society is more important. So that should individual suffer for the sake of society, should society suffer for the sake of individual. So this conflict between individual and the society is perhaps the oldest controversy in history of ethics, and even today this is one of the most severely, most fervently fought battle in the field of ethics. Which is more important, individual or the society? Which should change for the sake of whom? So, and in this conflict between individual and the society, Bentham take a very clear and strong side. He said that no, society is more important. And if individual has to suffer for the society sometimes, then that suffering is morally justified. So, this is what he said. So, this controversy is one of the most important controversy in ethics. Now, in order to understand this controversy between individual rights and the common good, we will take some examples. Think about these examples and well, try to understand, try to make up your mind or try to find out what does your conscience tell you in these examples, what is right and what is wrong, because remember, this is perhaps the most important controversy perhaps in the ethics. Today's class, I will introduce you about that controversy, but we'll keep on exploring that controversy in the later class also further in the new light, in the new manner. So, to understand this controversy, we'll talk about two important cases. One case that I will talk about will be more theoretical case, textbook case, and the second case that I will talk about will be a more practical case, practical life case in a way. So, two cases we will talk about this thing, but that we will talk about after a break. So, after the break we will talk about the two important controversies, two important case examples related to this particular thing, this particular controversy. That we will talk about after the break.